Thank you everyone for being here. I appreciate your time. So, as Mr. Finnegan was saying, my project is on redesigning a courtyard space at Newton North. So I'd like to start off by talking about the idea of engagement through design. So what this concept is all about is how can specific elements of a built environment interact with people? In what ways is it relevant to the people that this space is meant to be used? So if you're looking at a space at Newton North, you want to create some sort of design that pertains to both students and faculty and community members alike. And though what happens with, the importance of engagement through design is that designs can either be inclusive or exclusive. So an inclusive design, as I said, can welcome all different kinds of people to a space, but an exclusive design can cause a lot of problems, which is what brings me to my research on the High Line. So what we're looking at here is the High Line, which is an elevated greenway, or railway, now a greenway, that now runs through southwestern Manhattan. This is what the railway looked like before, and this is what it looks like now. So obviously, if I were to ask you which space looks more inviting, then you would say this space. But the issue behind the design of the space is that it was really not relevant to the neighborhood that it was built in. So West Chelsea, which is the neighborhood that the High Line was constructed in, was once more of an eclectic neighborhood. It was a mix of working class families, a lot of young bohemians, artists, hipsters, if you will. And it was already a gentrified neighborhood, which means that it already had an upward shift in property values and wealth, but not to the same extent that the High Line endorsed it. So what the High Line did is that it was so strongly subsidized by both corporate and corporate and public investment that the entire neighborhood was rezoned, and essentially what was once a more interesting neighborhood became bought out by high-end chain stores. So when you think of stores like Starbucks, Urban Outfitters, they took over a lot of sole proprietorships and drove out a lot of other businesses that were there in that generation in that neighborhood for many generations. So one thing that I want to make sure I clarify is the definition of gentrification. So as you can see, is a shift in an urban community towards wealthier residents and/or businesses and increasing property values. Now, I'm not saying that the High Line created gentrification. As I said, West Chelsea was already gentrified. But what the High Line did support was hyper-gentrification, which is, as a City University of New York professor, Neil Smith, coined, a systematic attempt to remake the central city, meaning that instead of having a self-driven movement of young, wealthier, well-to-do people moving into a city, this is really a forced, as I said, sort of corporate and publicly invested movement that is driven for profit. And so part of the problem with the High Line is not only is the way that it was funded, but the way that it was designed, and that it was unengaging and it was irrelevant. So the High Line essentially, it was a monument to gentrification rather than to the local culture. So if you look at other parks, such as Central Park in New York City, of course, property values around Central Park have skyrocketed. But if you look at the original purpose of Central Park, it was sort of meant as a leafy respite for a lot of the tenement workers in the industrial age, and as a place where, even if you look at today, where all classes are welcome there. It's definitely a space where you can see both the wealthiest of the New York elite and many homeless and working class, middle class families all throughout the park. But the difference is that in the High Line, it's not that way. The High Line is almost like a glamorous boardwalk where it's really only welcoming to the New York elite. And you see these fancy hotels such as the Standard Hotel, which is one of the most expensive hotels in New York City. It straddles the High Line, and it even blocks the views of places like the Hudson or the West Chelsea Piers, which were institutions that were very important to the neighborhood. And so this kind of just blocking out of the historical memory is quite patronizing and divisive, I find. And so how this connects to my project, of course, I'm not worried about Newton North becoming gentrified. Tigerslough isn't going to turn into a Starbucks. But what I need to think about is that how can I create a design that is relevant, that pertains to our community? And of course, although the consequences will be different, not hyper-gentrification, but the consequence is that the space may not just be used, and that's tens of thousands of dollars down the drain. So first, I'd like to talk about where the space is so we all are on the same page. So if you look at this between the art wing and the theater wing here, and it's in front of the ramped hallway, and you can see it on the aerial map, or this aerial view here, and then this is the original model. Is everyone on the same page? We understand where this is? Great. So this is the model of the existing space that we created. Those are our first steps. And this poster here, this is the poster that we presented to the Boston Architectural College. So the Boston Architectural College played a very important role in our project as they essentially collaborated on our design. I was basically one of the students at the Boston Architectural College. So they assigned 4 students to work on this project. And I was sort of one of those students proposing my own design proposals along with them. So our project goals, in going along with the idea of creating a space that's relevant and engaging to the local community, we wanted to make sure we had a contemplative space. So this contemplative space, the idea was this was to, especially in light of the difficult year we've had in North with deaths and even before that with passing, that we thought it would be worthwhile or very important to have some sort of commemorative space to think about, or to not necessarily mourn, but just to remember and think about what's happened. And then another important feature is a water feature for ecology studies. And this is what Dr. G and Ms. Dannenberg have been pushing for. Of course, very relevant to what's needed here is that to have a space where we can actually interact with and use for classroom and other academic pursuits, and an outdoor classroom, which not only serves as obviously an outdoor classroom, but an excellent place to eat lunch, to hang out, hopefully in the shade, which is what this space is certainly in need of. All right, so the first model we created, keeping these project goals in mind, is this here. And here's another picture of it, because it's probably hard to see from there. And I'll take you through our thought processes. So we divided the space into the 3 zones or the 3 project goals or purposes. So this is the water feature for ecology studies. This is outdoor classroom. And this is sort of a hangout space. And the water feature sort of doubles as a contemplative space, because not only can you teach a classroom here, but it's also a quiet space that does have a monument here. And so what this is, it's not necessarily a direct monument, but it's a combined sort of seating, reflective memorial sort of space, so that there's no one way to sit on it, which I find is important, because a lot of people, if you look at on the courtyard, a lot of kids don't use benches the normal way. A lot of kids like to sit on things however they want it to, and I think it's sort of restricting to designate a feature to be sat on one way. There should be multiple ways to interact with the features, which is why I sort of came up with this idea. And the high grass, which is represented by the paper surrounding it, sort of helps keep this area quiet, more contemplative, and such. And another important thing that we thought about was traffic. So if you look at the old model, this space was not very well designed for the foot traffic. A lot of the foot traffic is cut across this way or that way. And so if you notice, when you look out, a lot of people don't even follow the path. So we tried to keep that in mind with this model by looking at the pathways that people actually took to get to Newtonville, which is the most common use of the space, which is why we have this landing here, or to get to Tiger Drive. So that's another thing, just to keep the flow more, I guess, relevant and useful to the people using the space. And these are some more pictures. Here is because this area is naturally shaded and contoured, so it provides for an excellent space for a outdoor lecture. And then our classroom space is here. And so we thought it would be really neat to have a classroom space that were seated into the ground, but after our first critique, we learned that it's really not a good idea to reseed land that's on a wall because there are important features here for drainage. So we had to take that out. And that was sort of a whole new challenge that we had to think about, is that we can't really contour land along the walls. We had to maintain the topography along all the sides. And so, which brings me into the critique. So the most important thing about the critique, or the biggest thing we got out of the critique, is that our problem with this design is that we divided it so explicitly into the regions that we wanted it to. But what all their designs did is it sort of synthesized all the project goals into one. And a lot of these didn't reach the project goals. And of course, these are very ambitious and much more abstract. But what we got out of it is that we need a more common theme to unite our design, that we should really be looking at this as more of an art rather than just a placement of features for this specific purpose. And so if you look at these different ideas, there's an outdoor wall, which we thought was a really interesting idea to create like an outdoor threshold or a threshold for space. And again, this is sort of obviously not going to happen, but it's just really neat to see how other people think out of the box, especially not being at North and not knowing how the space is used. It definitely helped me rethink the creative process and how I can better create my design. So our next design, which is this 1/4-inch scale model here, tried to take a lot more of what I saw in the last critique into account. And it's a sectional model, which means it's in sections. And the sections are supposed to help the viewer understand more about the different features within the space. And because it's such a big model, and I really want to emphasize the idea of how the space is engaging and how it can be used, I use my little 1-inch scale buddy. His name's Clay, and he's going to show you around the courtyard. All right, so again, we have the same, very similar sort of seating that we saw here, except it contours out of this highest elevation here, goes under this wooden boardwalk, and comes back up. And again, it can be used however way the person using it wants to use it. And also it provides a contemplative space here. The idea is that we would have water reflect off of it, and even potentially water trickling down to create circulation, because we do need to circulate this water feature somehow, or else it's going to get gross. And the next feature is the boardwalk, which was sort of inspired off of what you see along the Charles. Again, it sort of goes along with the idea of creating a contemplative space, somewhere that's being able to sit on this little dock out here, and just being in sort of what should be hopefully a more peaceful area. That's definitely something that's important. And the water is also only 2 feet deep, because the idea that it would be no more than 2 feet deep, because if it's more than 2 feet, then we need a fence around it. So we thought if we, as long as it's less than 2 feet, it would be nice to really have that. There's no barrier between you and this water. There's no barrier between you and this contemplative space. And then here is one of the outdoor classrooms. So what we created here is 2 different ideas for how we can create a classroom. This one that you see up here, this would be as raised land, perhaps astroturf, because that's much easier to, requires no maintenance and it's cheaper. But the idea is that it's more of a natural flowing shape, and it would provide for definitely a good classroom space and a good place to hang out. The issue is that it would not provide shade. And again, we don't know how much more cost effective it would be versus creating this, which is our other classroom idea. And this would be a wooden structure that would be better at providing shade, because it would have these 2 walls. And the idea is that these walls could be used to put artwork or any other flyers, anything to sort of show the culture of Newton North, and to create more space that would be useful for that. And again, here's more places where you can relax and lie. And I want to talk about this hill here. So we got the idea from the hill of creating raised land from the critique. And we thought that would be a good idea because it provides not only a good space to have a classroom for ecology studies, but reclining on a hill is always more comfortable than reclining on flat land. And it also provides definitely a much more aesthetically pleasing view of the rest of the courtyard, having that raised land. And another thing that I forgot to mention quickly is that there would be a retaining wall along here, only about 2 feet tall, and that could provide as a great place just to sit down too. That won't get in the way of the traffic flow. All right, and again, a lot of the similar ideas. We had to move some things around because we are working on a third model now. But we'd have an outdoor lecture area here, and that this area here, which is where the art room is, we thought it was very important, and as did Ms. Slattery and Ms. Massoff, that we leave the space alone because it can be such a great area for them to renovate and put up their own work. And so this is one of my favorite pictures. This would be the view of the courtyard space from the art room. And so as you can see, you could see sort of the flow of this memorial seating structure. And one of the important things that Ms. Slattery mentioned, who was at a lot of these critiques, is that she wants to be able for her kids to paint a landscape from their room. So having this sort of a view where you can see a hill, a boardwalk, this sort of flowing shape definitely provides for a much more interesting landscape to paint than the flat land that's there now. And right now we are working on a third model. We are actually presenting to the BAC tomorrow. That's in the drafting room in many pieces. And we're going to have the whole PTSO on that meeting. And so it's definitely stressful. And quite honestly, I'm getting a little bit tired of having to go through all these motions. But what's so great about that is I've never spent nearly this long in any kind of design project. And so being able to see all the steps that go into it and thinking about all the grittier details and things that inhibit design and how you still have to look at it as one cohesive piece. It's definitely, as I mentioned before, it's definitely a humbling experience. And it taught me a lot about the finer details of landscape design. And it's still something I'm going to pursue, but I'm really glad I had this experience and learning about, in between my research and learning about engaging design and basically the power of green space. I think it really helps show that if I do go into landscape design, that it's something that really matters. So. Questions?
I got a couple.
Yeah.
So at one point you had mentioned a theme
Yeah.
that began to emerge. Could you tell me more both about the theme
Mhm.
and the process
right.
that brought that theme?
So the theme that and this is definitely becoming finalized in our third model, that we thought of was sort of the Serpentine Seating, and that we're planning on extending this to wrap all the way around to here. And it's also sort of illustrated in here. I should have made that clear, that the idea of having the seating kind of running through the space and having more of a flow, sort of as like an S-curve. And another idea that we had with creating a more common theme with this idea of serpentine seating or like a round flow is somehow uniting these two classroom spaces. So that would be by perhaps even linking these through a contour and making this a raised land rather than wooden seating. But the whole theme idea is something that we're finalizing in our third model.
Cool. And then a follow-up to that is, so you described a number of times receiving critiques. I'd love to hear more about how that process worked.
Yeah.
And then how you or your group responded.
Right.
To the critique process.
So I was prepared. I was told by my drafting teacher that critiques, especially in college, can be heartbreaking. And so I was prepared for my designs to get torn apart. But I actually felt like, in comparison to a lot of the other designs that the students were showing, that I feel like we held our own. And there were certain elements that they really liked. They really liked this idea that I showed in our very first critique with this sort of engaged seating. And so that's something that all the students sort of shared, and I really like that. But a really important thing that I learned out of these critiques is that you can't fall in love with any feature. You can't fall in love with your design at all, because things are going to change. And you have to embrace that change and be ready to completely rethink, start fresh from any design. That if you fall in love with one thing that maybe the professor or the students don't particularly like, then your design won't be able to change that much. You really got to be open to that kind of change.
And my final question is, so did Clay have a conflict today that he wasn't able to make it to the show?
Yeah, Clay, I think, got crushed somehow under the model, maybe.
Kind of missing his intro.
I know, I'm sorry.
He's having such a nice time.
Yeah.
He's having such a nice time in his face.
Yeah.
He's tardy.
Yeah.
Jacob, I have a question. Understanding that this space has that bank of windows that really generates a lot of intense heat depending on the time of the year and the direction of the sun. Has that been played in any of your designs at all?
In terms of the sun that...
Yeah, I mean, you talk about the fact that there are elements in here that don't allow for some shade, but it is a courtyard.
Yeah.
So there's actually a place where, as you're walking on the sidewalk, you can feel a dramatic climb in temperature. Have you factored that into your design concept?
Well, the most that we've done in terms of shade was this wooden wall. And another thing that we really liked, if I can go back a long ways, in one of the other models we saw, was this outdoor threshold, and creating an outdoor wall that can not only provide us shade, but provide us as sort of to differentiate between space. That's an interesting idea that we've been toying with. And I'm curious, and again, because it's not, our design is going to be combined with what the BAC has. So if we can find some way to synthesize this idea of creating shade through an outdoor wall with what we have now, that would be ideal. But I would say that our design probably did not address that issue as much as it should. Probably because there are just so many issues between the drainage, where the flooding is, and traffic flow, materials. There's a lot to take in, and that's another thing that I learned about landscape architecture, or just any design of the built environment, is how many factors you have to take in. And that is, I don't know how people can take care of it all.
When you started your ideas of design, did you make a list of what some of those mitigating things were that you would need to factor into your ultimate design?
So a lot of it was that we would do a sketch, and then, because I was working with, I got a lot of help during C block with some of the lower majors in drafting. And so a lot of it is I would do a sketch, and then we'd show it to some of the other students. We'd show it to our drafting teacher. And then they would say, oh, you forgot about this. And then we'd move it over a little bit. And it's like, oh, you forgot about shade. You forgot about this is where it floods. This is, this is where people like to sit. This is where they want the water. This is how they want the water. So it's all these different things that just, as you create more and more sketches, you just sort of start to fine-tune your idea.
I'm totally out of the loop on this. Is it actually some version of this going to be a reality?
Well, we have $40,000 thus far raised from the PTSO. It's not that much.
So how much would it really cost?
All right, so if we wanted to design this right here, this would probably be well over $150,000. And if you can manipulate materials to make things cheaper, like this could just be concrete again. AstroTurf is cheaper than raising actual land or real grass. but nonetheless, it's definitely an expensive venture. And at first, I was going to approach this thinking about sort of the pricing constraints, but I thought that because it's so limiting, that it would be better really just to try to experiment in more of a, given that, obviously this isn't like that extravagant. I wouldn't call it extravagant design at all, but in a more realistic and reasonable price range, this is how I would propose a design, rather than the very limited constraints we have now. And that number could go up. And it's also not, my design, I'll be lucky if one thing of this design actually gets built. Because you still have 3 other design concepts from the BAC that do incorporate some of my ideas that I've shared in the critiques, but I realize it's something that's likely not going to be built. But I'm okay with that because I had a lot of fun.
So does the PTSO have a relationship with BAC, so we're definitely getting something?
I think we're getting something. We're getting some change. I don't know what their relationship with the BAC is. I think the Miss Price kind of came in and initiated that collaboration. So, yeah.
Can I ask about the trees?
Yeah.
How come those do not make it to the second one?
All right. So the trees did not make it to the second model because we do not have 1/4-inch trees. But that is.
Okay, so they're in the design.
So yeah, they're in the design, but one thing we didn't really think about is where the trees would go necessarily. And again, trees are an excellent provider for shade, but we also don't want to necessarily block a lot of the views that you'd have from certain vantage points. But we definitely think trees are necessary. We just, in this step of the process, we were more concerned about more fundamental layout, I guess you could say.
Jacob, you mentioned as you were drawing through your conclusions about the future, has this changed your plans or reaffirmed your plans?
It got me a little less enchanted with landscape architecture as it was before, but I expected that. And I know that there isn't going to be any job out there where everything's going to be easy, or everything's just, I'm not going to have to go through any hardships. And so what I realized is that the kind of difficulties and the problems I had to solve and challenges I faced in this process is something that I'm willing to go through in order to get the final product, which I think is really valuable.
So you're going to continue?
And I'm going to continue, yeah.
And do what? So the rest of them know?
Oh, I'm for college, and I'm studying environmental design at the University of British Columbia. So it's sort of a mixed design program of any kind of the built environment that includes landscape architecture and architecture.
Congrats.
Yeah. Is that it? Okay. Thank you very much.